A reading from the Gospel of Thomas. These are the secret sayings that the living Jesus spoke, and Didymus Judas Thomas recorded. And he said, "Whoever discovers the interpretations of these sayings will not taste death." Jesus says, those who seek should not stop seeking until they find. When they find, they will be disturbed. When they are disturbed, they will marvel. When they marvel, they will rule over all. And when they rule, they will rest. Jesus says, if your leaders say to you, "Look, the Father's kingdom is in the sky," then the birds of the sky will precede you. If they say to you, "It's in the sea," then the fish will precede you. Rather, the Father's kingdom is inside you and among you. When you know yourselves, then you will be known, and you will understand that you are children of the living Father. But if you do not know yourselves, then you live in poverty, and you are that poverty. Jesus says, a person old in days won't hesitate to ask a little child 7 days old about the place of life, and that person will live. For many of the first will be last, and the last will be first, and will become a single one. Jesus says, know what is in front of your face, and what is hidden from you will then be disclosed. For there is nothing hidden that will not be revealed, and there is nothing buried that won't be raised. A word inspired by God. Namaste, my brothers and sisters.
Namaste.
So just to remind you, this is the third Sunday, so at the end of the homily today, I'm going to open it up as usual for a half an hour of question-answer discussion and stuff. So get your thinking caps on. I have a friend called Geneva Hartle, who's she's a social scientist over at SRI. She is working in assessments, creating national examinations for school kids. And she's an only child. Her father was an Italian Catholic and her mother was a Russian Orthodox. And she was grew up in this pristine condition, this little girl on her own. And she told me one time of a story when she was about 3 years. And she's sitting in a little sandbox in her back garden, in her little pink dress, playing with her dollies, all on her own, and all of a sudden, for no reason whatsoever, a bee stung her. And she got really, really upset. She ran home crying furiously that the pain of the sting, but what was upsetting her more than the physical discomfort was the fact that she said to her father, "And I hadn't done anything to him." So kids have this innate sense of justice. So what was really, really hurting her wasn't so much the physical pain of the sting, but the fact that she'd been minding her own business, and all of a sudden this bee came from nowhere and just stung her for no reason whatsoever. She couldn't figure it out. It didn't make any sense whatsoever to her. Now, there's a modern movement in biology. It's been led by two great South American biologists, a guy called Varela and a guy called Maturana. Yeah? And they came up with a notion that they call biological phenomenology. And it's the notion that if you want to study anything in nature, there is no point in, let's say it's a frog. You want to study a frog. There is no point in trying to study a frog from a human perspective, as if somehow frogs exist in our world and our reality, and in order to understand frogs, you have to try to situate them within our cosmology and our systems so as to understand them. They claim, no, you want to understand a frog? You have to get into a frog's world viewpoint. You've got to see the world the way the frog sees the world. They call this biological phenomenology. You get the phenomenology of the creature you're trying to study, their worldview, their perspective. Now, it is no more real or no less real than ours. We just happen to have a particular sensorium, particular kind of cognitive processes, and those deliver to us a particular model of whatever is out there. We have no idea what's out there. There's the myth of the given tells us that we have no idea what's out there. We simply have a sensorium and cognitive processes that develop some kind of a map of it, and we presume the map corresponds to the reality. We have no idea. The frog's reality is equally valid. So to really understand a frog, you have to join with the frog and see the frog's worldview. Now, it may well be, in fact, that this may be the next stage of moral evolution for human beings, the ability to perceive and to see the world from a whole bunch of other perspectives. In fact, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that a measure of enlightenment, as we begin to progress and to evolve as individuals, a measure of how well we're doing is our ability to multi-perspective, to walk in a whole series of moccasins, to begin to see other perspectives. We don't necessarily have to agree with them. We may even choose subsequently to challenge them or to confront them. But we need to be able to firstly adopt other viewpoints in order to progress. Now, if this is true as individuals, I think it is even more true as cultures. I think maybe a measure of the evolution of a culture is its ability as a culture to see the perspectives of other cultures. We may subsequently disagree with them and challenge them, but if we can't inhabit and walk in their moccasins, we haven't evolved very far. So it was ludicrous to me to see, for instance, during the Iraq crisis, when we were trying to persuade our allies to attack Iraq with us, the French refused, and we wanted to rename French fries and call them freedom fries. Now, what kind of a measure of cultural evolution does that speak to? So the ability as a culture to understand the perspectives of other cultures is very, very important. And maybe most importantly of all, it is the ability to go back in human history and to perceive other eras of our own history. And while we may evaluate them from our perspective, we have no right to judge them except from their own perspective. There is no point in going back 500 years and judging, an era 500 years ago by modern standards. We can evaluate it by modern standards, but to judge them by modern standards would be the equivalent of laughing at an 8-month-old baby because she still hasn't learned how to speak. It is appropriate for an 8-month-old baby not to be able to speak. Now, if she's 16 years old and can't speak, we've got problems. So we can evaluate from our perspective, but we don't have the right to judge from our perspective. We have to go back in and try to see the situation in which people at the time found themselves, and then see from that perspective what makes sense and what kind of responses they made. And so as I was reading the scriptures for today, this struck me. I'm looking at this new movement, this Jesus movement over 2,000 years. And I see the very, very different cultural and political and military circumstances in which it found itself. And I'm trying to say I can judge it from 2011, or I could try to judge it from 500 AD or 900 AD or whatever. And so as you look at this movement as it found itself, here's it's a kind of a mystical movement within Judaism. That's the first sense in which it finds itself. How did it respond to life from that context? How could I join with it and see what the issues were and what the responses might have been? At some stage, it became a non-Jewish movement. The tail began to wag the dog. So many Gentiles began to join this movement that it is no longer a Jewish movement. How did they respond to that kind of circumstance? For about 300 years, this entire group is persecuted, actively persecuted. What did that do to their thinking and their organization? How did their structure change, and how did their doctrine and their dogma change in response to this circumstance? And when finally in 313 AD, they're legitimized, how did that change their world perspective? And when they became the darling of the Roman Empire and they took over power from Rome, and now they're a power in their own right, how did they respond to those kinds of circumstances? So I've been trying to join with those different eras of Christian history this morning and see, how would I respond if I were a person at that time, not Sean O'Leary from 2011, looking back in hindsight, which is always 2020. If I were present then, how would I be viewing it and how would I be perceiving it? And so this morning I want to make 3 main points then. I'm going to talk about the Nag Hamadi Library, from which the last 2 readings are taken this morning. That's the first point. And then secondly, I'm going to talk about Thomas's gospel. And then thirdly, I'm going to take one phrase out of the gospel this morning. I'm going to call it the search and examine what that means for me. So the first thing is this. I'm going to talk about the Nag Hammadi Library because it's almost as if anachronistically we got a view of the early church that was only discovered in 1945. And here's the story behind it. In December 1945, 2 brothers, a guy called Muhammad Ali Samam and his brother, were digging for fertilizer in limestone caves in northern Egypt. And they're digging in the caves and they uncovered this big, big jar. And at first they're really superstitious. They think there might be a genie hidden in the jar, so they're afraid of it. But they're fascinated by it. And they try to open it and they can't, so they hit it a smack and they break it open, and they find a whole cache of material. They find, in fact, there are 11 books in it, leather-bound books, 11 complete ones and 2 partial ones. Subsequently, it will emerge that there are 52 tracts, theological tracts here. Most of them are Gnostic tracts, and one of them is actually a partial translation of Plato's Republic. There's over 1,100 pages of material in this stuff. Now, they have no idea what it is. It's written in a language called Coptic. Coptic was an Egyptian language which used the Greek alphabet. It existed up to about the 1700s. It kind of disappeared pretty much after that. Although there are some, I believe there are 300 Coptic speakers left in the world. But pretty much it died out as a language in the 1700s. So these guys didn't speak Coptic, and they were literate. They couldn't read anyway. So they brought it home, and their mother freaked out. Their mother was convinced when they told them where they got it and where it was, that it was definitely a genie in a bottle, and she didn't want it in her house. So she burned a whole bunch of it, threw it in the fire. So we have no idea what was there. Maybe that's part of why the reason there are 2 partial books in it. She burned a whole bunch of the stuff, and she told them, get it out of the house. I don't want that in the house. So they sold one piece just to kind of test the market. They sold it to a Cypriot antiques dealer, and they got a bit of cash for it. And then there was a dispute between the two of them, and their mother wanted the stuff out of the house, so they gave all the material to a Coptic priest. And he showed it to his brother-in-law, and his brother-in-law recognized there might be some real cash value here, so he sold another copy to the Coptic Museum. And the scholar in residence at the Coptic Museum, who spoke and read Coptic, recognized immediately this was really, really important stuff. So he wrote an article, the first article he wrote in 1948, speaking about this kind of stuff. Over the course of the next few years, this Coptic priest, through his brother-in-law, started selling this stuff to an antique dealer who began passing it on to the Department of Antiquities in Egypt. And when Egypt revolted in 1956 against British rule and threw off Nasser created independence, then all of the material was given to the Coptic Museum in Cairo. But there was one codex that escaped, and it was sold to a Belgian antique dealer who tried to sell it in New York and couldn't sell it. And then he tried to sell it in Paris and he couldn't sell it. And finally it was acquired by a man whom I met in London in 1987, a guy called Giles Quispel. And Quispel gave it to Carl Jung on his birthday in 1951. And so it's called the Jung Codex. And Jung kept it. He died in 1961, and then there was a dispute. What's going to happen to this codex? Now, some people wanted to give it back immediately to Cairo, but other people said no. They haven't published any of the material. They're just sitting on it. We're afraid if we give this back, nobody will ever find what was in it. So they kept it until 1975, and they finally published versions of it, in German obviously, and in English in 1975, and then they gave it back to the Coptic Museum in Cairo. So now all of the material is finally back in the Coptic Museum in Cairo. So that's kind of the story of its evolution. Now within that material, here's my second point then, probably the single most important find was the Gospel of Thomas. And the Gospel of Thomas, this is the only full version of the Gospel of Thomas extant. Now when they began reading it, they suddenly realized that in 1898, in a monk's grave in a place called Oxyrhynchus, which is also in Egypt, they had discovered fragments of the same book, except it was in Greek. Now, the one they found at Nag Hammadi was in Coptic. And the Coptic version, the manuscript itself, goes back to about 340 AD. But the Greek version that they found at Oxyrhynchus goes back to about 200 AD. So it's very, very obvious that this was written in Greek and then translated subsequently into Coptic. So the belief system is that the Gospel of Thomas very probably came from an oral tradition and was first put in writing maybe in 50 AD, which would make it older than any of the New Testament writings. The first New Testament writings are by Paul, and he begins writing about the year 51 AD. The first Gospel, Mark's Gospel, isn't written until 70 AD. So the Gospel of Thomas is probably 20 years older than the earliest of the canonical Gospels. And so there was a story, came an oral tradition, oral sayings of Jesus, and it's a gospel, but not in the sense of being a narrative. It's not the story of the life of Jesus. Like you find the other four gospels are stories about Jesus' activities, where he lived. Two of them talk about his birth circumstances. They all talk about his death. The Gospel of Thomas does none of that. The Gospel of Thomas is 114 sayings and parables and dialogues of Jesus. There's no narrative about his life in it at all. And so it's a very, very, very different kind of a document. Now, it's very much based on a kind of a Gnostic, dualistic thinking, because it's responding to the times. So when you look, for instance, at, there are many sayings in Thomas's Gospel that you find in the New Testament, and you find it at Oxyrhynchus in Greek, and you find it in Nag Hammadi in Coptic. And the movement is from about 50 AD to 200 AD to 340 AD. And you can see that there's a very definite shift. There's a redacting going on. There's an editing process going on. And it's becoming increasingly Gnostic, increasingly dualistic on one hand and mystical on the other hand. As you go from the 50 AD version to the 200 AD version to the 340 AD version, it's changing very significantly because it's finding itself in different sociological and theological and political kinds of circumstances. Now, why was it hidden in the first place? It was hidden in the first place because in the year 367 AD, the Bishop of Alexandria, a guy called Athanasius, condemned all non-canonical writings. And they were banned, and when they were found, they were burned. So it's very, very probable that a local group of monks hid this material sometime around the year 367 AD to preserve it, and it lays hidden for almost 1600 years. It was found in 1945. So that's kind of the material. So what's the theology that you find in the Gospel of Thomas? What's the deal? According to what we just read today, it's a book which was composed by Didymus Judas Thomas. Now, in some senses, it's a duplication because Didymus is simply the Greek word for a twin, and Thomas is simply the Greek word, is simply the Hebrew word for a twin. So it says twin, Judas, twin, in Greek, Hebrew. So it's a duplication of the word twin, one in Greek and one in Hebrew. Now the middle name then is the real name, Judas. But Judas and Jude and Judah are the same thing in Hebrew. They're just very different versions of the name. So very probably this was a book written by the same guy who wrote the Epistle of Jude, which appears in the New Testament. Now Jude, in some of the Gospels, is called the twin. So he's known as Thomas. So Thomas is not a proper name. Thomas is a kind of a title, a nickname given to him. Judas, the twin, to distinguish him from Judas the Iscariot, from Iscariot. So very, very probably, this is the Thomas we find in John's Gospel. Now, when he talks about himself as the twin, Didymus, the twin, Judah, Thomas, the twin, he's claiming that he is Jesus' twin. And in fact, in the New Testament, there's evidence as well that, that the Thomas in the Gospel was a twin of Jesus. Now, is this a biological twin, or is it a spiritual twin? Is this somebody who's literally biologically related to Jesus that came out of the womb at the same time? Or is this a spiritual companion so close to Jesus that he's like a spiritual twin to him? There's debate, obviously. If you're a Catholic, you can't believe the former. You have to believe the latter. You can't believe that Mary had other kids, that she bore twins at the time that she bore Jesus. But this is the evidence that he was the twin. And he's talking then about the secret sayings of Jesus. So the very first line is, he says, these are the secret sayings of Jesus. Now what does the word secret mean? It means that there are some teachings which are delivered to everybody. Anybody who has ears to hear, let them hear. But then there are select teachings which are only given to the initiate, or those who obviously are able to unpack the message at much deeper levels. No matter what message we hear, in any discipline, whether it's anthropology or zoology, each one of us can only unpack the material according to the level, of which we're proficient in that particular discipline. And the same thing is true in spirituality and in theology. And whoever is speaking, whether it's an avatar figure like a Buddha or a Jesus, every single one of us can only unpack the material according to the level that we've reached ourselves. And so in many traditions, there would be secret teachings for the initiates, those who obviously were capable of unpacking the material more adroitly or more mystically, were given different kinds of teachings. There's a saying we had in Ireland, I don't know if you have it here, that little minds talk about people, and greater minds talk about events, and the greatest minds talk about ideas. Do you have that notion here? Yeah? So, people, gossipers just talk about people. People who are a little bit more advanced talk about events, and people who are more advanced talk about ideas. And I think people who are really serious talk about mystical ideas, that's the end of the spectrum. So in some senses, that is what Didymus is saying today. Here's a bunch of sayings for people who are interested in mystical ideas, who don't want to just gossip about Jesus. Or they're not just talking about events in his life, but they're talking about the ideas and the cosmology and the mysticism that he came to reveal. Here are the sayings for that group of people. And so as you listen to them, they're obviously, they're metaphorical, they're allegorical, they're mystical, and they're very, very deep. So you have to try to unplug them at that kind of level. So he says, here are the secret teachings of the living Jesus. Now he's making a differentiation between the physical, biological man, Jesus of Nazareth, and between the inner divinity that animated this person. Because interestingly enough, nowhere in the Gospel of Thomas, nowhere is Jesus called Lord or even Christ. He's just called Jesus. So in Thomas's cosmology, Jesus is an avatar, but he's a biological creature just like the rest of us, but he's driven by an inner divinity. He recognizes his own inner divinity, and it's the same inner divinity that you and I have, if only we can recognize it. So Thomas will never use the word Christ of him or the word Lord of him. So that's his basis. So as cosmology then, you can say, because it's Gnostic, it could suffer from a kind of a dualistic notion that the world is basically divided into two. There's a material component to the world, which is about darkness and death and suffering. And this is presided over by a character which is called in Thomas's Gospel and elsewhere, Yaldabaoth. So literally the lion ruler is the name for it. So it's like the ruler over the forces of darkness. And then there is the kingdom of the Father, which is the kingdom of light and love and life. So there's this dualistic struggle that goes on between the two. Now both early Christianity, and Gnosticism in particular, and Judaism were very, very heavily influenced by Zoroastrianism. So for instance, when the last two tribes of Israel were taken into exile in the year 587 BC, they were deported into the land of Babylon. And Babylon was overcome very quickly by the Persian Empire. And in the year 529, the remaining exiles, the Jewish exiles, were allowed to go back into the land of Israel. But for the 70 years that they had lived in Babylon, they had been subject to Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrianism was a very powerful spiritual and religious system at the time that had two very definite divinities. There was Ahura Mazda, and there was, Michael, help me out here, what was the second one? A being of light. Ahriman. Ahriman, okay. Yeah, that's the force of dark. So Ahriman was the force of dark, and Ahura Mazda was the god of light. So both Judaism and early Christianity are very heavily influenced by this motif of light and darkness. And you find it in John's Gospel as well. So you find it very strongly in Thomas's Gospel. This dualistic notion that there is a material world which is about darkness and death and sin, ruled over by this Yaldabaoth. And then there is the kingdom of the Father, which is of light and life. And the denizens of these two aspects are very, very different. So the vast bulk of people on the earth, according to this kind of dualistic notion, are actually lifeless, soulless creatures who were created specifically to serve Yaldabaoth. And then there's a few people who look like human beings. They seem to be in the same kinds of spacesuits, but they're the alive ones, except they're asleep. They have been intoxicated by incarnation. They have been seduced by the physical bodies in which they found themselves into believing that they're like the rest of us. But when they hear the teachings of Jesus, these people wake up. Now, there's a modern correlate to that if you read any of the kind of New Age stuff. People who regard themselves as star children, that somehow they've come from parts of the galaxy that the rest of us didn't come from, and they have a kind of inner knowing that the rest of us aren't privy to. So this is a very, very, very old notion, that the vast bulk of us on the planet are really soulless, lifeless creatures created by this Yaldabaoth to serve him, whereas there's a few among us who incarnated, but who got seduced by incarnation into thinking they were human beings like the rest. But when they hear the voice or the teaching or the secret message of Jesus, then they come awake and they realize that in fact this is who they are. So this comes through very, very strongly in the teaching of Thomas this morning. Which brings me to my third point. I want to pick out this one phrase at the beginning of the gospel this morning. It fascinated me as I was meditating on it today. There's one phrase that, if you seek, you will find. And if you find, you will be disturbed. And if you're disturbed, you will marvel. And if you marvel, you will rule. And if you rule, you will rest. It's a very interesting sequence, because we would think that it should be only 3 steps. It should be seek, find, rest. But there's 3 pieces in here, stuck in here. So seeking and finding is not the same thing as rest. So there's a paradox going on there. So you would imagine that if you find it, you should rest, but you don't. According to Thomas, if you find it, you're going to be disturbed. And you think, okay, if I'm going to be disturbed, then I should be uneasy. But no, he says if you're disturbed, you'll marvel. You think, okay, so if I get to marvel, then I should rest. He says, no, if you marvel, you will rule. And you think, okay, if I'm going to rule, I'm going to be busy. And he says, no, if you rule, you'll rest. So there's all these paradoxes built into it. So what is it about? It's a beautiful pithy articulation of what we actually experience in our spiritual journey. Those of us who are anyway serious about the journey, we're searching. We're looking for something. In most of our lives, looking for something. We're joining some group that tells us that this is the truth. So we're seeking, most of us are seeking. When we find, however, we think that instead of saying, okay, this is it, I'm happy, we're going to get disturbed. So what does that mean? When you really find a deep, deep truth, it is be hugely disturbing because it is totally going to blow your existing paradigm. You may be even excommunicated by the group you belong to. You may be disowned by your family. Your culture may think you're crazy. But if you really, really find deep mystical truths, it is a very, very disturbing phenomenon. Because very often you have to try and shake yourself loose from all of your relationships and all of your connections and all of the groups to which you formerly belonged. So it is a very disturbing thing when you find this new paradigm. But when you do find this new paradigm, what happens after getting disturbed? There's a sense of marvel because you can't believe, that the world could be this good, or the system itself, or the mission itself had been this extraordinarily beautiful. So there's a marveling at the plan God had in mind in setting out this trajectory for us to follow. So the marveling comes after the disturbance, the real understanding that this really is worth pursuing. And then when we have that level of awe at the process, then we rule. We're not ruling over anybody. It's not a sense of power over other people to visit our will on them. It's the ability to come into the fullest alignment with the self, to realize who the core essence is. And the ruling then is over ourselves. It's the spirit taking charge of the incarnated body. So the ruling is not domination over other people. The ruling is about coming to fullest alignment where the soul is calling the shots and the ego is merely the CEO of waking consciousness. And then the rest happens. Rest in the sense that you can't be disturbed subsequently. Nothing can throw you. When you finally get it, that there is only God, that everything is simply an emanation from source or an articulation of the divine, you realize that every flower, every sunset, every mountain, every person is just another articulation of the divine, then there's no place else to go and there's nothing else to worry about. There is only the rest. So let's open it up for question answer discussion. Can you give me a 5-minute heads up, Michael, when we're almost there? Yeah. We'll go for about half an hour. Yeah. Sweet. Jerry.
I missed out how we got back to 50.
Okay.
Was there something that you could date at 50?
Okay. So Jerry's question is about, he missed out the 50 AD piece of it. So the documents are found in 1945. The parchments and the paleography. There's a study in ancient documents where the style of writing will indicate the period of its composition. So alphabets change and orthographies change. And so scholars, paleography is the study of old writing systems such that when you recognize, for instance, at one stage, about 300 AD, Greeks began to use commas in the Greek for the first time. So if you see a document with no commas in Greek, you know it's older than 300 AD. So from paleography, they can establish when a document was written. Also from the materials on which the stuff was written, you can tell at some stages they started using vellum, at some stages they're using papyrus. So all of these are clues as to when the stuff was composed. But more importantly is kind of the thinking and the content of these documents also indicates when did these ideas come into, when were they created for the first time. So although the documents were found in 1945, and they could establish that the stuff that was found in Nag Hammadi, those actual documents go back to about 340 AD. The stuff they found at Oxyrhynchus in 1898 was older stuff. So it was the same material in Greek rather than Coptic, and they could date that precisely to 200 AD. But then they started looking at references. So for instance, Saint Irenaeus, who flourished about 185 AD, had made reference to Thomas's gospel. So we know now it's before 185 AD. So you keep looking at references, language, linguistic styles, content, and then you begin to see, what gave birth to what. And when you compare, for instance, the canonical gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, where there are many parallel sayings that you find in Thomas, it's obvious, but the scholars can estimate very quickly that Thomas's articulation of these sayings is antecedent to the ones that you find in the others. And so the consensus is that Thomas's gospel was composed in written form somewhere between 50 AD and 100. 50 would make it earlier than any of the existing New Testament scriptures. 100 would make it about the same time as John's gospel.
Go back to this idea of the dualism of dark and light,
right.
And then the analogy you drew at first about the frog, and you've got the frog perspective.
Okay.
It seems to me that most of us are too quick to jump into the duality if we're presented with a stark event that we want to categorize, whereas perhaps all of us really lie in all of these gradual outlooks to see the universe. How do we overcome this tendency to want to look at dark and light as opposed to having just lots of different viewpoints?
Brilliant. Fabulous. Brilliant. Did everybody hear Al's question? So there's tendency on our part to kind of want to immediately reduce any experience down to a dualistic notion of it's either light or it's equal to dark, that there are many, many, many gradations. So how do we stop ourselves from jumping immediately into a position of this is good, this is bad? I think only mysticism allows us to do that. And mysticism, in a sense, will articulate itself in a cosmological, philosophical paradigm. So cosmology is simply the best explanation a person can come up with for the reason why the world is the way the world is. And so cosmology and mysticism, in some senses, are the two legs in which we walk together. Now, my own hit on, to answer your question directly then, is that the further we go back towards source, the more we realize that there is nothing except God. I'm totally convinced of it. I've said to you before that life as we experience it is a dream that the ego is having. And the ego is a dream that the soul is having. And the soul is a dream that spirit is having. And the spirit is a dream that source or God is having. So we live within nested dreams. Now when I say dream, I don't mean it's not real. Dreams are real. When you're dreaming, it is absolutely real. So you're just in a different state of consciousness. So every state of consciousness delivers its own model of reality. So if you can join through biological phenomenology with a frog, you're seeing a real world. It's going to look very, very different from the world a frog is seeing, or the world that a dinosaur saw, or the world that a human being saw. But they're equally real. They're just predicated on different sensorium and different cognitive processes. But as we work our way back from ego to soul, to spirit, to source, it becomes more and more important that everything that exists in the phenomenological realms is simply a different articulation of source. The divine drives everything else. And so in some senses, it is an artificial and not a particularly useful distinction to talk about light and dark, or to talk about good and evil. Everything is as it's meant to be, because in the evolutionary trajectory, as we move back into the guiding principle of all evolution, which is a movement, an inexorable movement toward love. That is the driving force of all evolution, as far as I'm concerned. That is the basic law of evolution. It's not survival of the fittest, it's not spontaneous mutation, it is an inexorable movement back into love, where all the parts are reassembled back into themselves. Now in that movement, I think we have to go from being automatons to having free will, to having freedom. And there's a big difference between free will and freedom. So automatons are beings who are just driven by instinct. They have no choice about their responses to life. And that's, that's one stage of the life process. At a subsequent stage, we develop free will. Free will is the ability to do as I please. Freedom is very different. Freedom is the ability to do as God pleases. So the only truly free person is the person who is in total alignment with Source. So in Catholic theology, there's a very interesting definition. They say freedom is the ability to choose the good. You think, oh, if I have to choose the good, yeah, I'm not free. You're only free when you're able to choose the good. Because if you're choosing anything less than the good, you're addicted to something. You're addicted to avoiding pain, as Buddhism would say it, or you're addicted to an attachment to pleasure. And so addiction is an artifact of free will. But free will is meant to move us on to freedom. So the evolutionary trajectory is from being automatons to exercising free will to exercising freedom. Now, in the absence of light and dark, in the absence of good and evil, there is no opportunity of moving from free will into freedom. Nor is there the opportunity of exercising compassion or love. If we found ourselves in a totally perfect world, there would be no opportunity for exercising either free will and developing freedom or for exercising compassion. There would be no reason to be compassionate. So all of this is part of an extraordinary plan. Now, it's not to say that we embrace the dark or we embrace the evil, but we are meant to respond to it. I'm not saying that, some things that happen are not undesirable. Of course they are. You see a baby being killed, in a sense, that's not a good thing. But the question is not, is it a good thing or a bad thing? The question is, how do you respond to this situation? You're going to respond in anger, you're going to respond in compassion, you're going to respond in love for all the beings in it. And so the way to overcome this dualistic notion is to sequentially move back towards Source, into the realization that we live in some senses in a perfect manifestation and evolutionary trajectory in order to move us from automata to free will to freedom and compassion. Kathy.
So I'm not following the logic.
Okay.
Okay, so you started out saying we can't really judge things, evaluate things from our own personal perspective. We try to get into the perspective of whatever it is and whatever's happening to that. And then somehow we got to Thomas writing down the twin, whoever it is, writing down the words of Jesus. And now you're sort of telling us what you think those words meant. And so how do you get from what you think those words meant based on your experience as a human being in the 21st century to what they meant to Thomas in 2000 years?
It's a brilliant question, Kathy. So how can I, as a 21st century being, pretend to be able to interpret what Thomas meant, in 50 AD? It's a great question. Now, I want to redefine a few terms in order for us to tackle this question. My first redefinition is I want to redefine what I mean by truth. I want to redefine what I mean by truth. For me, truth is not the same as fact. Something can be factual but not truthful. Something can be truthful but not factual. So here's my definition of truth. Something is true if it transforms me and aligns me with Source. And something is radically true if it transforms me, to my core and aligns me permanently. So truth is not the same as factoids. It's a fact that it's now 10:35. Is that true? Is that transformative to you? That you really say, oh my God, 10:35, wow, I didn't realize it, what a great day. It's totally non-transformative. So that's the first predefinition. So for me, something is true if it transforms me. Secondly, I want to define what I mean by reality. Reality is not that which is delivered to us in waking consciousness by our sensorium and cognitive processes. Reality is an artifact of a state of consciousness. And when I get into different states of consciousness, there are totally different realities. And it's not that one is more or less real than the other, but it may be that one has more and more importance than the other. So I think, for instance, this waking consciousness is perhaps the least important level of reality. A much more important level of reality is the realization that there is only God. So, for instance, when you get into deep, deep mystical states, the reality I experience then is more important. It's not more real, but it's a more important reality than the reality I have when my eyes are open. That's the second definition. The third one I would say is that imagination. Imagination is misunderstood as the faculty that allows us to make up stuff which isn't real. And I don't believe that for a moment. Rather, I believe that imagination is the faculty that allows us to download information from one level of reality into a different level of reality. And so that's how science, that's how science proceeds. One of my favorite examples was, at the very same time, Isaac Newton in England and Leibniz in Germany downloaded calculus at the same time. They were plugged into the ether. They didn't invent it in some senses, they downloaded it. And my final definition, in order to respond to your question, is memory for me is not just my ability to recall factual information that happened to me at previous stages of this incarnation. That is not memory. That's only one tiny aspect of memory. There's a whole subconscious level to my memory. There's a pre-incarnational level. I can download information from other incarnations. It's available. I can visit the Akashic Records, which was God's videotaping of everything that all of our grandchildren ever did throughout the universe. So information is never lost. So it's only a question of accessing it. How do you access that information? So now, having kind of prepared my ground, I want to respond to your question directly. How can I, as a 21st century person, go back into the mind of Thomas in 50 AD and tell you what he meant? I'm not telling you what he meant, I'm telling you what my perception of what he meant is. And so when I transpose myself into the culture of the time, and from history, I know some of the parameters, and through imagination, I can go back into that kind of space, and through accessing the memory banks, I can get recall of some of those informations. And the entire constellation is, I now sit in a position where it seems to me this is a reasonable interpretation of the data. I'm not saying it's factually accurate. You may do the very same exercise and come to totally different conclusions. And if that's transformative for you, if that brings you nearer source, that's great, then it's true. If my interpretation brings me nearer source, it's true. If it takes me further away, if it makes me, for instance, prejudiced against some group, if it makes me lack compassion for some people, then it's not true, even if it happened to be factual. So there are ways around it. There are ways that we can use our psychic abilities, because we exist at least 7 different levels. We have a physical body, yeah? We got emotional, we got energy bodies, we got astral bodies, we got a mental body, we got a causal body, we got soul body, and we got spirit body. Now, if we can learn to utilize and to kind of step into those realms, then we have access to information to which we're not normally privy. Yeah. Trish.
Earlier you were talking about Thomas's word seek, you should find,
Okay.
be disturbed.
Right.
And I was wondering, with the disturbance, sometimes I think about like the outer culture that we live in, and I might feel like I'm kind of in this Christ consciousness place, or I'm trying to, and I might be like in my workplace and people are working more from an ego place. And I was wondering if you had certain practices that you do that help you to, stay aligned, or would deal with that disturbance and knowing what you want to do versus what the culture is.
Okay, that's a great question. And so are there any kind of practices where once I'm disturbed by my search and I find myself to be at variance with the cultural viewpoint, are there any practices that I could do to try to align myself more clearly? So some of them are this kind of biological phenomenology, where I can try to adopt the mindset of different beings. Meditation is a very powerful way. It's probably the most important way of all, because the entire object of meditation is the disidentification with ego and the re-identification with higher and higher levels of the self. So that would be one practice. For me, spending time in nature is really, really important, because when you meet nature at its own terms, particularly if you're on your own, if you're with somebody and you're talking, it's a very, very different experience, because you're going to frighten the animals away and you're not going to be paying attention. If you go into nature on your own and spend quality time just being in nature, you see some extraordinary kinds of stuff. And it shifts your state of consciousness. And when you shift your state of consciousness, you have access to a whole different kind of worldview. And so you can do this through imagination, as I've defined it. You can do it through meditation. You can do it through time spent in nature. Or you can do it by spending quality time with little children, particularly kids from maybe about 3 to 9 or 10. Because they live in a world where the veil between the mystical and the mundane is fairly diaphanous. Otherwise, we live in a world in which the cultural trance has concretized the fact that this is the only reality and everything else is make-believe. And if it's make-believe badly enough, you're crazy. Little kids don't have that problem. Little kids are able to play. They're able to manifest, imaginary friends, But they're imaginary in the sense in which I'm defining imaginary. Not that they're making this stuff up, it's that they're downloading, encounters with beings in other levels and other dimensions. So there's 3 ways that this can happen. So let's say, for instance, we just take 3 dimensions. There are, in actual fact, there are a myriad of dimensions. We live in a reality in which there are multiple dimensions enfolded in each other. And it's not a question of different locations, they're just different energies and different frequencies totally folded into each other. And when we learn to fine-tune our antenna, we can access any of those states of consciousness. Now suppose I just reduce it down to 3. So there's A, B, and C. Consciousness A, consciousness B, and consciousness C. And let's say, for instance, that your default position is that you normally reside in A. So you'd normally reside in a state of consciousness where you grandiosely call waking consciousness, your eyes are open, your alarm clock went off, you're awake and you're alive, and you think this is reality. And that's your reality. Now something happens to you. So there's other beings in space B, and their default position is B. They normally hang out in B. Now you do something different in A that changes your state of consciousness. Maybe you meditate. Maybe you're fasting. Maybe you have an illness or a fever. Maybe you're doing drugs. But you shift your consciousness some way, and all of a sudden, you've migrated into dimension B. And now you're encountering beings who normally reside in B. And you think it's imagination. But it's not imagination. These are the beings who really who inhabit B. But you can only get into B if you're in B consciousness, and you're normally in A consciousness. Now sometimes beings in B do something that allows them to transmigrate into A. And I think this is what happens with little children. And with me sometimes. When I have encounters with leprechauns or fairies, which I do occasionally, I know what's happening is they're doing something that's shifting them into this consciousness, and I can encounter them. So that's the second way it can happen. And the third way is I can do something that shifts me into C consciousness, and these are doing something that at the same time shift them into C consciousness, and all of a sudden we both find ourselves in C consciousness and we encounter each other. And it's not my typical default consciousness, and it's not their typical default consciousness, but we happen to be in the same place at the same time, and we encounter each other. So there are lots of ways into those kinds of spaces. Now the overall arching question for me then is that a truthful experience? In other words, is it a transformative experience? Am I nearer to source because of it, or am I just gone crazy because of it? Am I more prejudicial or less prejudicial? Am I more compassionate or less compassionate? Have I got a greater appreciation of the multiplicity of God's manifestation or a lesser appreciation? So they're the questions I would ask myself. Annie?
Going back to the little girl with the bee sting.
Good. Okay.
It's that same thing.
Totally. Yeah.
That consciousness that this bee did something and she was not a part of it.
Exactly. That's brilliant. Yeah, sure. So let me just question and I'll get back to you. That's a great question, Annie. She goes back to the story of my friend Geneva and the bee sting, different consciousness. Suppose for a few minutes I could join with the consciousness of the bee. And I'm flying, doing my own business. I'm a bee now, gathering pollen, and all of a sudden I see this pink thing. I may think it's a flower, a fairly big flower. But I land in order to see, is there pollen here? And all of a sudden, the little girl freaks out, and I smell the pheromones of fear, and my response is defend myself, sting. And so it's not that I just attacked her, from nowhere. I was doing my job, and somebody reacted in a certain way through fear, and I reacted in the same way. Or it could be, if I were to anthropomorphize a little bit, here's the bee going along, I'm the bee going along, I see one of these human beings, and they're a pain in the ass. They steal our honey all the time. They cut down our flowers, they destroy our habitat, and here's one of them, and by God, I'm going to get my own back. Bang! And I sting her. How do I know the reason for it? But it's definitely, it happened for some kind of a reason. There was some worldview in which this action was called for. Janie.
I wanted to go back a bit on talking about what Trish was commenting on about that one of the middle stages of disturbance.
Okay.
And it's and she was talking about maybe ego disturbance, maybe like work or something like that. And then you suggested like meditation in nature. And I think that this isn't not a question but a comment for response. And if we practice meditation and stay in nature, then we slowly change our default mechanism. So when she's at work maybe and there's a disturbing thing, her default is new. and she has shifted that, and it's easier to go back into a Christ consciousness, alignment, and peace. And I also think, second thing is, if we really study, you know, you brought up seek, find, disturb, marvel, rule. To unpack that will set us free.
Mm-hmm.
And it is so rich and it is so deep that to be able to do it in a quick, it can't. But if we can take the time to really understand what disturbance is, because when we seek and find, we start seeing something new. And that third step of disturbance is telling us we're no longer happy unless we stay in alignment. So that disturbance is the most important thing. The disturbance is telling us we're out of alignment. It feels like death. It's the ego death. So I would really love to unpack that at another time.
Good, good. Did everybody hear what Jane was saying? So she pulled together, building on what Trish is doing, that, you know, you're in a situation where, a work situation where your mindset or your kind of reality is different from the people you're working with. And Jane has built on that and said, if you are meditating regularly and you're spending time in nature regularly, then your own default position becomes different. You bring a different kind of consciousness to your work situation, so it's harder to throw you off balance in that situation. And then she built on that with the second piece, using the 6-stage model that Thomas presented here, and focusing on the disturbance aspect of it. When you really, really get disturbed and you start changing your worldview, then your state of consciousness changes and your default position is different again. So our 2 points are very, very closely linked. Your default position changes if you're exercising regularly enough to adopt a different mindset or a different kind of reality, so that you can't then be thrown subsequently that at this stage you're filled with marvel for the pluriformity of God's creation. So that's a great point. Great point, Jen. Cecile.
I wanted to talk about the bee for a second. It's more likely, a honeybee is a very peaceful creature, that it was a wasp. And that the wasp was to the ground and perceives the world as a much more threatening place than it really is.
So that's an interesting point here. Bees and wasps have very different worldviews. One of them is paranoid and the other is really, really happy. So obviously bees meditate a lot more than wasps do. Okay, brilliant. Thanks. Thanks, Cecile.
So it seems to me it makes a difference about the quality of the seeking.
Okay.
Going through this 6-stage option, whether you seek with,
Speak up.
sorry, Jerry.
It has to do with the quality of the seeking. If you're going to take these 6 steps, that you can't seek with a certain expectation. You can only seek with a surrender.
Interesting. Interesting. Brilliant. That's a great point. Brilliant point. So Karen is saying that the quality of the seeking, you know, is very, very important, because if you're seeking with expectation, the results are going to be different from seeking through surrender. That if you're open to what the universe has to offer you, then you're going to find a very different set of circumstances than seeking in order to find what you expect to find. Because it's very difficult to find what you don't expect. It's very difficult to see what you don't believe in. And if the culture tells you that something doesn't exist, it's very difficult to experience that which the culture tells you does not exist. So the quality of your seeking is really important. Absolutely. The ability somehow to search with an open mind and to allow the data to present themselves in whatever fashion they need to. Yeah. I know your name. What's your name?
Sorry, it's my first time.
You're very welcome, Pet. Give me a hug.
I'm a friend of Lee Ferguson.
Oh, you're very welcome. What's your name?
I don't know if he's here today, but
He's not. No.
I'm
he's
just
not.
thankful for the invitation.
Okay. What's your name?
Mary.
Mary. You're very welcome, Pet. Great.
Thank you.
Great.
I'm wondering what the evidence is for transformation.
Okay. What the evidence is for, great point. Okay. So what is the evidence for transformation? How do you know that you're changing? And 5 minutes to go. Okay. Obviously there's a difference between transformation and change. Change is any kind of rearrangement of the components. Transformation is a positive insofar as we could define that. So if you have, for instance, a jigsaw puzzle, and you tumble a jigsaw puzzle onto the table and you want to assemble it. And typically what you'll do is you'll find the 4 corner pieces, and then you find the straight pieces, so you have a frame, and then you have basically 3 hints subsequently. You have the contours of the pieces, you've got the colors on the pieces, and you've got the picture on the box. So there are the 3 pieces that are guiding you forward. Now, you know that you're going in the right direction if the picture on the box is emerging. you know that you're not going in the right direction, or the picture in the box is not emerging. You're a small little child, and you got all these pieces, you just squeeze them all together. And you got all the pieces together. But you don't have the picture on the box. So what is the picture on the box? The picture on the box is that God is love. And anything which is not of love is not of source, in that sense. God is compassion. God is openness. There is nothing prejudicial about God. There's no darkness there. There's no anger there against it. And so I have to look at what is the picture that's emerging as I live my life. Am I becoming a more loving person? Am I becoming more prejudicial? Am I kind of becoming fundamentalist? Or have I more people that I designate as my enemies? Or is there an openness and a love in me for all God's creatures, not just God's human creatures, but for everything? So it's to kind of look at, if you have an idea of what the picture on the box looks like, and you begin to see, as I put these pieces in, is the picture emerging or the picture is not emerging? And there's one final consideration. When you get a jigsaw puzzle, every piece that's there is necessary. And every piece that's necessary is there. You're not going to find that you finish the jigsaw puzzle and there's a big hole, you're missing 14 pieces, go down to the shop and buy them. That's not going to happen. Nor are you going to find that if you complete the jigsaw puzzle, there's 3 pieces left over. That's not going to happen. So everything in your life is part of the jigsaw puzzle. You have everything you need in order to bring to fruition the pictures that's on the box. And when you're finished the job, there won't be pieces that you wonder, what the hell am I going to do with these pieces? Every piece will fit into the picture. How are we doing, Michael? Okay, so maybe one last comment or question. Rita. That's really, really brilliant. That's where you're absolutely right. And I'm sure. So what Rita says, sometimes you can put the wrong piece in the wrong place, it screws it up. That's really, really important. It does. Yeah, if you've done jigsaw puzzles, you realize at some stage, let's say you do a 2,000 piece jigsaw puzzle, and you're left with 150 pieces, and there's 3 or 4 holes on the page. And what the hell happened there? And then you come to this awful realization, oh my God, I don't believe it. That whole section up there that I put together, because the contours fit and the colors seem to fit, they're not in the right place. And then having the ability to take those off and start redistributing them, that's huge. And that's exactly what Thomas meant when he said, when you find, you're going to be disturbed. Because you're going to find you've got a whole bunch of pieces in the wrong places. Because your parents told you to put them there, or the church told you to put them there, or the politicians told you they belonged there. And now you realize they don't belong there. If I'm to create the picture that's on the box, I have to have the courage to disassemble a whole bunch of the stuff and redistribute the pieces. Great, we'll call it a day. Sorry, did you? Okay, Chris. The Lost Gospel of Mary was actually found in 1895. Yeah, so it was found 50 years before that. Yeah, yeah. Charlie.
That's a quick question.
Okay.
Were any of these Coptic Gospels published besides this one by?
Oh, they've all been published. They've all been published now. Yeah, that was the reason that the Young Institute didn't want to give back the Codex Young, because they wanted to put pressure on them to actually publish all this material before they surrendered the last piece. So they were all published by 1975. All of them were published. Yeah. So thank you for your patience, guys. So before we continue with our Mass, before we continue with the offering, I want to take time out and let's offer each other a sign of our peace.